This introduction includes my base defense. It also includes my explanation of why I am doing all of this. I include it in every section of this documentary. Feel free to skip to the 6-minute, 37-second part of this video to see the start of the actual segment. Welcome to my documentary about why I refuse to pay the IRS. In November of 2023, I got 2 bills in the mail from the IRS. They were for back taxes from the years 2010 and 2011 and totaled a little over $40,000. And then in November of 2024, when I got back from donating time in North Carolina and helping people last year, I had 13 letters in the mail from the IRS. And after adding all of those up, it equaled a little over $40,000 there. So adding them all up together, I owe the IRS a little over $82,000. And that's just what I know of. This is accumulation from the last 15 years of my life. Everything I own in this world is worth less than $5,000. I personally choose to help people hands-on instead of paying taxes. I don't intend to respond, but I am fully ready to defend myself in court if it comes to that. And I am not running in any way, shape, or form. My number is 573-286-8316. I'm leaving the ball in their court on deciding on where this goes. I have drawn a line in the sand, and I am standing up for my core beliefs. I morally refuse to continue to contribute to the crimes our government is committing. I fully intend to represent myself in court and stand up for these beliefs and morals. I have represented myself many, many times and won every single time. Our Constitution guarantees us the right at a public jury trial. This is my constitutional right for due process, and it's something that they cannot overthrow or take away from me. Every single judge or public official has sworn an oath to the Constitution, and they have to honor that oath. There's a process called jury nullification, where the jury can decide not only the guilt or innocence of the person on trial, but the justifiability of the law itself, meaning that the jury can find a person innocent, even if they know the person committed the so-called crime. The courts don't like to admit it, but the juries also have the right to decide if a law is unjust, and they can choose not to convict someone because the law isn't right. The jurors can choose to follow their heart and their morals, instead of just being forced to follow the laws that these corrupt politicians endlessly create. Jury nullification is a great thing, because it's a form of checks and balances between we the people and the politicians that are creating endless laws. This is pretty much the only tool that we the people have to stand up and set things right. The system tries to silence any form of jury nullification because they know it's their biggest threat to their power. Lawyers can't even mention jury nullification because they swore an oath to the bar, and in order to keep their bar license, they have to follow the law to a T and can never question the law itself. If they do, they lose their bar license. But I don't have a bar license, and I'm just defending myself from charges they bring against me. The Constitution guarantees my right to do such as well. At any time, the jury can choose to ignore a corrupt law and instead follow their morals and do what's right. I need a unanimous decision in order to actually be found innocent and change things. But if one juror chooses to stand strong and morally won't budge, then it will hang the jury, and it will have to go to a retrial. Only so many retrials can happen before they have to dismiss the case. So one person does have the chance to change things. I have absolute faith that there are good people in this world, and I have faith in due process, so I'm not scared at all. And I know that if this ends up going to court, that there will be some good person that will stand up and help set things right. These videos will be my defense in case I'm ever silenced and not allowed to defend myself. This should definitely be recognized in a courtroom setting, and it needs to be included as part of my defense. I intend to keep everything absolutely 100% public and out in the open, and will even make a documentary of the whole entire process. Legally speaking, I should not be forced to be an accessory to a crime. The things I'm bringing up in these videos are crimes that the government is committing, or things that I morally don't agree with and will not support. It is now up to the prosecution to prove that the things I'm bringing up are not crimes, and that they can somehow force me to pay for something I don't morally agree with. As part of my defense, I would like each video in this series to be played individually. Legally speaking, I cannot be forced to be an accessory to a crime, and morally speaking, you can't force me to pay for something that goes against my beliefs. I should not be held liable for refusing to contribute to criminal activity or be forced to do something against my morals. I am standing up for my beliefs and will not contribute to these crimes that they are committing. Therefore, I absolutely refuse to pay the IRS. Forcing someone to pay something against their will is theft, and I feel that taxes are extortion. You can look up these definitions in the dictionary and see that I'm right. Once again, I challenge the prosecution to prove otherwise. I do have a resolution and solution that I'm offering. If I had a multiple choice layout in which I could voluntarily fund the departments that I want to fund, then I would be able to voluntarily contribute to the entities I wish to contribute to. I don't mind helping out and doing what I can to help humanity, but there are lines that I have drawn, and I won't work to help hurt humanity. I don't mind paying for roads and disability, but I will not help fund wars. But we should all have the freedom to choose the departments we wish to contribute to. Republicans should be able to fund Republican stuff, and Democrats should be able to fund Democratic stuff, and we should all have the freedom to just fund what we want to. And we should not be forced to contribute to things we don't morally agree with. We all have different perspectives in this world, and it should be our individual freedom to decide what we wish to morally fund. And from there, if the government worked from the budgets that we voluntarily give them, we could balance the budget tomorrow. Instead of allowing the government to do whatever they want and create endless debt that our children and grandchildren will have to pay back, we voluntarily give them a budget, and they are forced to work from the budget that we voluntarily give them. This is what true freedom looks like. I had a little boy that passed away 17 years ago. I was able to hold him in my arms, and I promised him I'd do all I can to help make the world a better place. So the biggest thing I can see that would help the world right now is trying to create peace. I know not paying my taxes may not seem like I'm trying to create peace in this world, but by refusing to pay for war and all the other terrible things our government is doing to harm people, I'm at least doing something to try and take a step in the right direction. And at the very least, I can choose not to support it. Ultimately, all of us just want the freedom to do our own thing and be left alone. So I feel freedom is paramount to peace. As long as there is no victim, there should be no crime. But if there is a victim and somebody has been harmed, we must seek out justice through due process. The system seems so backwards that those who are in power and running things are massively harming people. Yet they're allowed to get away with it and do whatever they want. And at the same time, our courtrooms are full of people who are there for victimless crimes. And the only crime they have committed is not properly buying their freedom from the government. Whether you believe freedom is our God-given right, our constitutional right, or just what's morally right, at the end of it all, as long as we don't harm anyone, we must be allowed the freedom to do as we wish. I recently received 15 separate bills from the IRS for 13 years of back taxes. As a response, I am making 15 videos on laws the government breaks or things they do that go against my morals. I cannot legally be forced to aid and abet in a crime by paying for it. I should also not have money extorted from me to fund things I morally don't agree with. I start with the largest amounts owed and the things I feel most passionately about. This video is number 2 of 15. So this video is going to be about the Federal Reserve. Simply put, the Federal Reserve gives the illusion that it's a publicly held entity, but in reality, it's owned by private individuals who are manipulating the system to create mass amounts of profits for their pockets. The Federal Reserve is comprised of 12 big banks. These banks give off the illusion that they aren't privately run because the people that run these 12 banks have to be appointed by Congress and the president. But at the end of it all, it's not owned by the government. There is no government agency in charge of them, and they are free to do whatever they really want. They can run the Federal Reserve however they choose to please. They've made it to where these so-called governors that are in charge of the Federal Reserve are just basically the fall guys for what the Federal Reserve does and creates. They try to say they're not privately owned, but I think George Orwell called it doublespeak, and it's pretty apparent all through. The screenshot you're looking at is from the U.S. government's website of the Federal Reserve, and they claim that they are not a privately owned entity. But if you go to one of the Federal Reserve's actual banks and look at their website, you'll see that they actually do say it can be considered a private entity. And from there, they go on to say that they don't make any profits and that there isn't any way they can make money. But then lower on down, you see that they're legally required to give dividends to the banks below them. And that's where the money is made. Each one of those 12 banks is comprised of a bunch of local banks in our local communities. Those banks are owned by shareholders, and you can never tell who owns the shares and how many. So one person or group could own shares in every single bank in the Federal Reserve and own a lot of everything, and we wouldn't even be able to tell or track it because everything would be hid behind shareholdings. So here's just a random example that I was able to pull up. I went and looked at the Federal Reserve's website of the banks that are in each division. This was in the Boston division out of one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks. And like I said, they got a bunch of smaller banks under them. And so those smaller banks, I just randomly looked up one, and it was Charles River Bank. And once I did some research into that bank, I realized that it was owned by Charles River Development. Here's where I'd like to point out that Charles River Development claims to be in charge of 1/3 of the world's managed securities, which they claim is 60 trillion with a T in assets a day they manage. I'd like to point out that our national debt as a country for our entire existence since we were created is $36 trillion. So then upon further research, I learned that Charles River Development was bought out by State Street, which is one of the three major investing companies in this country. Pretty much everything in this country is owned by State Street, BlackRock, or Vanguard. They own everything. They own shares in almost every single business there is in the entire country. I mean, you can try and name a major company that is traded on the stock market, and you go look it up, and you'll see that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are major shareholders in every single one of these companies. Every single one. Name them. Just try it and pick one out. Make a game out of it. Just pick a corporation and type in the words into Google. Does Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock own stocks in any company? This one's Cheesecake Factory. Yes, they're the largest stockholders of the Cheesecake Factory. Every single company in this country, they own every major aspect that runs our lives and every company that has a part of it. Whether it be our most important resource like food or hospitals and pharmaceutical companies, major energy companies, major news stations and networks, even the for-profit prisons like Core Civic. So they even make money off people being in jail. They're obviously the main shareholders of all the banks as well. And then to the one that gets me most. They're the top shareholders of all the major defense contractors. The military is the number one expense that our taxes go to. Me personally, I wouldn't spend any money on the wars that are happening currently. But that's the largest part of our country's budget. These defense contractors have the ability to get paid whatever they want from our government, and we have no say in it whatsoever. We can't control that. They can charge outlandish, crazy amounts for weapons that hurt the world and have the potential to destroy the planet, not just for us, but for future generations as well. The president is in charge of this budget and could stop these perpetual wars at any time. But every single president chooses to continue to fund these perpetual wars. These three investment companies are the top shareholders of every single company in the United States. Just try to imagine how much power and pull that brings with it. They have a monopoly on the entire market and therefore own our country. And if you look, they even own majority stake in each other. The most BlackRock stock is owned by Vanguard and State Street. The most State Street stock is owned by Vanguard and BlackRock. And Vanguard, they just run things a little differently, but at the end of it all, BlackRock and State Street still own major parts of Vanguard. So with all these companies and everything going on, people's identities can easily get hidden. These are just suggestions that Google gave me when I asked if I could hide my identity as a shareholder. So this is what they gave me. It says you can hide your identity through a nominee shareholder, in which I guess somebody else is your front man. You can do it through an LLC, where you can just create a business to hide money and run it through. And you can even start a private company and run everything through that private company as well and hide everything through that way. And then finally, there's offshore accounts to where we know that doesn't have to be tracked. And that's in different countries and stuff, which we don't have control over that. And since they have different laws, they can legally get away with manipulating the system and hiding their identities and doing whatever they want. And when I asked Google if Vanguard, BlackRock, or State Street had to release their investors' individual names, no. The answer is no. They don't have to. People's identities is completely hidden, and they're all hidden behind shareholders and investment companies, so you don't really know who owns how much of anything. Theoretically, a very small group of people that are ultra wealthy, like super ultra wealthy, could own a very huge part of the system, and we wouldn't even know it. We wouldn't be able to tell or track it down because they can hide everything so well through all these different investment companies. So what they've done is figured out how to almost have a monopoly on our entire system without us publicly knowing or having any idea that they have this monopoly. We have given these companies and the unknown people that own them absolute power over our system and don't even realize it. All they have to do is just use their massive fortunes and play around with the money. They can sell all their stocks all at once and have a whole bunch of money. Doing so would make everything crumble like in the Great Depression. And then after everything bottoms out, turn around and buy it all back up for super, super cheap because everybody has no choice but to sell. And that is what they want. They play the market like that. They actually like the lows because they invest in the lows. But I'm here to tell you, we're in multiple times as much debt as the Great Depression. And this society is not ready to live like that. When this happens, there's going to be absolutely absolute chaos. And the government will use this chaos that they created as an excuse to gain more power. And the only outcome is going to be the ultra wealthy are going to make mass profits and be able to buy up all of our stuff because we're broke. I know there are just normal people out there with a little bit of money in their bank account that think they're going to be able to reinvest and make some money on this. But it's going to be so hard, it's not even going to be comprehensible. And it is not a thing we want in any way, shape, or form. There is no denying that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street seem to own almost everything around us. This is just a way to cover everybody's tracks and make it to where nobody knows who owns what. It's a very real possibility that ultra wealthy families and elite groups of people could have created secret societies and groups and just hide their identities through everything, and that they really could possibly control everything around us, and that they may have a monopoly on our system and we don't even know it. Fortunes like what Elon Musk have, and him supposedly being the richest person in the world, could just be a tiny drop in the bucket to what these entities and groups have and what they really own, because they're able to hide it all. And they don't want to be out in the public. I know that may sound crazy, but there is history to show us that it's 100% possible and actually did happen. So I guess this is time for a little bit of a history lesson, and just follow along and just try and imagine things from the standpoint that there might be an ultra wealthy group of people controlling everything. And that they're not doing it out in the open because they don't want us to know. They know we wouldn't want them to have this monopoly, and that they would want to do all they can to keep control, but yet not let us know that they're really running things. In 1902, John Rockefeller started the General Education Board. This department is the foundation for which our entire school system is based and how everything is set up. One of Rockefeller's more famous quotes was, "I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers." So he designed the school system for control and to make us basically like worker bees. But if you think about it from his standpoint, if you can control the people's brains, you can get them to do whatever you want. You just got to give them the information that you want to give them and make them believe what you want them to believe. If you can control the minds of an entire nation, you can control that nation. So in 1911, John Rockefeller owned Standard Oil. And Standard Oil was the biggest oil company out there. They owned everything to do with the entire oil industry. There was absolutely no denying they had a monopoly. Around 90% of all the oil in the United States was owned by them. And at that point, the government said that they had violated antitrust laws. I think it was the Sherman antitrust law. And that Standard Oil had to split up into a bunch of different companies. And they were no longer allowed to have the monopoly that they had. Which, it was the same person that owned it. I mean, think about it. John Rockefeller owned it. So now he's standing there looking at his Standard Oil company, and he's like, okay, I just got to take my one main company and split it into a bunch of different smaller companies. Okay, let's see if you recognize some of the names. The main one was ExxonMobil. From there was BP, Conoco, Phillips 66, Marathon, and Chevron. And he still owned them and was still in charge of them. He just had to be more secretive about it. And this is when the secret part of not letting us know what's going on came in. This is when they decided they had to keep it from us and keep the fact that they actually run everything from the public. That's when everything started to be hidden, and hence why they want to hide things now. Now, originally, Rockefeller and Standard Oil was sued by the government in 1906. They were found guilty by the state in 1910, and then they took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled yes, it was a monopoly, and they had to split their company up in 1911. In the middle of this, in 1910, a secret meeting to create the Federal Reserve was had, and it was on an island. It's called Jekyll Island, and Rockefeller owned property there, JP Morgan owned property there, Vanderbilt, Wahlberg, all the major players. You can, once again, go to the Federal Reserve's website, and they'll openly talk about this secret club of ultra-elite people that started the Federal Reserve, and they're not even shy about it. They just leave it all out in the open and don't even care. But they'll tell you about this secret meeting that they had during the same time when they were being sued for monopoly laws, and in which they created the Federal Reserve. It wasn't passed until 1913, but man, this does not sound like a logical answer in any way, shape, or form. I don't understand how the people would not see through this, but somehow they managed to fool the people into doing it. I'd say money had a lot to do with it, but it's really just so hard for me to comprehend While our government was in the middle of suing Rockefeller for monopoly laws and abusing the system and doing whatever he wants, they allow him to create a monetary system and have full control over all of our money in the entire country. How could this logically make sense? Obviously, this guy's going to be a little upset, and obviously he's trying to run the whole world. Why would you give him the power to do that? Maybe because at the same time all of this was happening, the Titanic also went down, so the whole nation was just distraught and was distracted by that. Coincidentally enough, all the major people with political power and money who opposed the Federal Reserve happened to be on the Titanic. Plus, Rockefeller had taken charge of the school system and could teach people what he wanted to teach them, which probably didn't include much of the bad stuff about him. So a couple years later, in 1913, those in charge of the government seemed to have a plan on how to basically enslave the entire country. Instead of directly enslaving us, they did it more casually through economic slavery. The first thing they did was create an income tax, which was a way for them to take a portion of our entire life's work. This is straight up extortion because we don't openly agree to it, and the fact that they are doing it against our will is nothing more than extortion, and taxation is theft and should not be allowed. If the average tax rate is 14%, that means 1 out of every 7 days of work of our lives, our entire lives, will be taken from us. We have no say in where this money goes, and many times it'll go to things we morally don't agree with, and the politicians in charge of it just squander it and waste it on the most ridiculous things you could ever imagine. The same politicians also pass 1,000-page laws that lobbyists write, and they don't even read them. We give up 14% of our entire life's work. That's not just a tax rate, that's time, and we only have so much time on this planet. The Declaration of Independence predates any other legal document in this country, and the Declaration of Independence clearly states that I shall have the ability to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And if I'm being robbed against my will, that is not liberty, and that impedes my pursuit of happiness. So the 16th Amendment needs repealed because it is in direct conflict of the Declaration of Independence and my chance at life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The Declaration of Independence even verifies this and gives us the power to abolish this amendment. The Declaration clearly states that whenever any form of government becomes destructive to our life, liberty, or pursuit of happiness, that it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. We just have to have the courage to stand up and fight for our freedom. And I want to make it clear that I'm not promoting violence in any way, shape, or form. When I say fight for our freedom, I mean exactly like I'm doing in a courtroom, and take this to court and stand up for ourselves that way. I think they almost want us to try and be violent because they know they have much better weapons, and if we become violent, that will give them the excuse to use them, and then take absolute control because we became violent. So we always must remain as peaceful as we possibly can. So ironically enough, after they created the IRS, in December of that same year in 1913, they then created the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is no more federal than Federal Express. It's a privately owned entity that is just comprised of a bunch of large banks. This isn't run by we the people. This has no oversight. And it's really nothing more than a way for the banks to manipulate the financial system. And those people that run the banks are just prospering massively off the manipulation of everything we work our entire lives for. Now, they had control of the dollar, but they didn't really control the entire financial system because there was still gold out there, and people could still buy and trade gold and use that as a monetary system. So in 1933, they made gold illegal. Think about that. They actually made gold illegal. Why would they do something like that? Well, it's so they could get control of the entire monetary system and force us to use their dollar and nothing else. Now keep in mind, at this point, the dollar was still backed by gold. And in theory, you could trade each dollar for gold, even though we had to trust them that they had enough gold to back every dollar, and it was just a complete trust scenario. Not to mention it was still illegal for us to have gold, and we could never actually own it anyway, so they made it to where we couldn't verify. So for the next 38 years, we just had to completely trust this private entity that they had enough gold to back up the money that they were printing and creating. We just had to trust them with our entire financial system and that they wouldn't manipulate it at all. So in 1971, our government decided to eliminate any way to hold the Federal Reserve accountable or keep track of anything. We went away from the gold standard and a tangible object backing the monetary system. There was nothing backing them, and they could just create money out of thin air and create inflation and prosper off that, manipulate the system, and do anything they wanted. And that's when we the people lost total control over our dollar. And this is where things really went off the rails. This should be the point where I bring up fractional reserve banking and try to explain how it all works. The worst part about fractional reserve banking is that they're openly allowed to cheat the system. If you deposit $100 into your bank account, they can take that $100 and reloan it and give all of it to somebody else. So now what they've done is they've created $100 out of thin air. The 100 that they gave to somebody else that was your money, and then the 100 that they still owe you. So that's $200. Now the $100 bill that you trusted them with and that they gave to somebody else, let's pretend that that other person went and deposited it into their bank account. Now guess what their bank can do? Their bank can then take the money that that person gave them and magically create another $100 and loan it out to somebody else. Now, you're never going to guess what can happen if that person goes and deposits that money into their bank account. You guessed it. That bank can then create $100 out of thin air and loan it to somebody else again. Each person is owed $100, so there's $300 worth of money, all being created from that first 100. And guess what's happening to all $300? Each one of those banks is now charging 7% interest on the money they're loaning someone else. They're charging interest for all $300. So that first 100 that you put in that you're getting 3% for, each bank is now turned and is made 7% off of. And these banks can do that indefinitely. It can just keep going on and on and on and on forever. If the banks pass the buck forward 15 or more times, making 7% each time, they have now made more interest off that dollar than that original dollar is even worth. Now imagine if instead of $100, it was $100 million, and banks just use this money to play around and pass around back and forth to each other, and use this fractional reserve banking ability to manipulate the system. This basically creates an infinite money glitch out of nothing, and all the banks work together to just create money out of thin air. And this process can go on and on and on, and just create thousands and millions and even billions of dollars. This is a total and complete manipulation of our monetary system. The amount of interest they could create off every single dollar once it's in their hands is pretty much infinite, especially at 0% when there's no brakes stopping them in any way, shape, or form. This is the first time ever in history the reserve requirement has been set at 0. Previously, it was set at 10%, which means once you gave them 100, they could loan 90. And then once that person dropped it in their bank could then loan 80. And this would only go on for 10 times until it would come to an end. But now that it's at 0, it's indefinite. It can go on forever. The banks can just loan money back and forth to each other and are free to just go crazy. This free reign to do whatever they want is going to catch up with us really quick. It's almost like they've deliberately taken all the brakes off and are letting the banks just run wild because they know that the system's going to collapse soon anyways. The fact that no politicians or anybody in power is screaming about this 0% rate really makes me suspicious. It's almost like they got a new system planned and ready to be put in place. They're just going to milk this one for as much as they can before it crumbles. Now, their fractional reserve theory is currently working, but only as long as we don't get fed up with the people screwing us over and ask for our money back. And if we do get fed up and ask for our money back, the system's going to crumble. And I'm sure they're going to blame it all on us, even though it's all their fault for not managing the money properly. But they kind of got us in a tight spot. We can't really even stand up and do anything because if we did, the system crumbles anyway. So there really is no way possible to even try and get all of our money. It's just not there. And the worst part is, now that all these banks have this fake non-existent money, they can now go deposit this imaginary money into the Federal Reserve and receive a 6% dividend payment from the $100 billion that the Federal Reserve printed off this year, and then hide all the profits through BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. And the true cost of them manipulating the system like this is going to be inflation. So things are going to cost more for us, and life is going to be harder. We're the ones that are breaking our backs while they cheat the system. The only way to stop all this and keep the system honest is to set a reserve ratio at 100%, meaning that banks simply have to keep and save the money that you give them, which is what we're paying them to do anyway. The fact that they aren't could be considered theft, except instead of stealing from one person, it's stealing from the entire country. We just don't notice or realize it's going on. But if we all went to go get our money out at the same time, we would suddenly realize that they stole it all and used it to cheat the system. And once again, I refuse to be an accessory to theft, especially when it's stealing from almost every person in this country and it's ruining our economy in the process. All they have to do is be honest and keep the money that we give them and not loan it to somebody else. And make sure that for every dollar you put in there, they have to keep it and hold on to it. This will ensure our money is safe, and this will ensure that they can't manipulate the system. Banks can just loan money and charge interest from money that they've already made from us all these years. They can stop using our money to manipulate the monetary system. We are allowing them to use our money to create economic hardships for ourselves. Anything less than a 100% rate leaves the door open for corruption, as well as the possibility for the system breaking down because there isn't enough money to cover what's loaned. The Federal Reserve now prints over $100 billion every single year. Here's a screenshot from the Federal Reserve's website on how much money they've printed the last couple of years. This huge amount of money they print off every year is guaranteed to cause inflation. But they use this money to pay for dividends to the banks that have money in their account. A big bank can deposit money into the Federal Reserve just like we deposit money into banks. Now let's take a look at mortgages. So what they've done is they've created these things called MBSs, which are mortgage-backed securities. So that means that banks can take a whole bunch of mortgage loans and all your guys' homes and take them to the Federal Reserve and basically sell them to the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve buys them because they know that you're going to have to pay them off eventually. So once again, this is just a way to manipulate the monetary system and create money that isn't there. So the Federal Reserve will write them a check for all these mortgages and basically buy the mortgages from them. Now the banks are still taking a cut because they're processing and handling stuff and doing everything. So they still get a percentage of everything. But the Fed just gets the bigger percentage. After the banks buy all of our homes with money they don't have, if it ever starts to catch up to them, they can just simply go and sell all the loans to the Federal Reserve. This allows them to escape responsibility for the fact that they don't really have the money to cover all these assets. But they really don't care. They were just in it to make the interest on it while they could. That free interest money is the bottom line and what they're after. So after they sell the whole 30-year note to the Federal Reserve and basically give your home to them, they can then take any extra money they make and reinvest it back into the Federal Reserve and then make 6% dividends off the money they reinvest. So let's do a quick recap on how all this works. You put money into a savings account. The bank pays you anywhere from 0.5% to 3%. They take that money and then re-loan it out, and they get anywhere from 5 to 14% on the loans that they give from your money. The downfall is that they've spent your money and they no longer have your money. They then take turns passing this money all around back and forth, creating money out of thin air and making interest off the money every single time they create more money out of nowhere. Then once they start to get in trouble because they're spending money they don't have, they just simply sell all their debt and all of our homes to the Federal Reserve. And now the Federal Reserve owns all of our homes. They can then take the money that the Federal Reserve gives them for manipulating the system and cheating us out of our homes, and then deposit it back into the Federal Reserve and get 6% interest on dividends. And then they hide and manipulate all the dollars they make through BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, and most of the time avoid paying taxes on it, so they don't have to contribute to the system that they're ruining. And that's once again another reason I won't pay my taxes, because I see how all the people that are running the system don't pay taxes and cheat the system. And they're just breaking our backs, making us pay for everything. And it's not right. I don't pay taxes and I use cash. And even do a lot of trading and bartering. But I do all I can to not contribute to the system that is holding us all down. They make all of this happen by printing $100 billion every single year to pay the dividends to the banks and the manipulation of our entire financial system. The $100 billion is basically just how much they make from manipulating our financial system. And they do this every single year. So if you take the number of 100 billion and divide it by the 8,000 banks, that equals 12.5 million for every single bank in the Federal Reserve. Now obviously big banks are going to get a lot more than the small banks, so that's not a perfect number. And there's obviously other things that the Fed's going to be spending money on, but that's just a rough way to figure out a rough number. And once again, they're able to sweep all that money under the rug through Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And keep in mind, the cost of all of this is inflation and the devaluing of our dollar. Every time they print a dollar, they create inflation and massively hurt we the people. It's destroying our economy and destroying our country. Also, these banks and elite people can make some money. And these banks are allowed to do whatever they want and just run rampant. Our president and Congress could stand up and do something about it. They really don't have any legal pull, but they could definitely bring awareness and do everything they could to try and stop this. But they don't ever do anything, which tells me they're all part of the system and bought off. Every single one of them. I don't trust a single one of the presidents that we've ever had, or Congress members for that matter. The fact that they're not doing anything about this shows that they don't work in the best interests of we the people, and that they work for the banks. There's only been one politician that I've ever trusted. That's a congressman from Texas named Ron Paul. He always fought to bring our troops home and create peace in this world, and he always stood up to the Federal Reserve. He's retired now. So in 2008, the housing market crashed. And when the housing market crashed, the Federal Reserve's response was to print off a bunch of money, and they created these things called quantitative easings, where they printed off trillions of dollars and gave it to the banks. And those banks then were going to distribute to us the money, and they called it the trickle-down effect. Not because they were telling us it was rain when it really wasn't, but because they figured that the money would trickle down from the big banks, and they would loan it to us, and everything would be saved. And we believed them and let it all happen and bought it all because because it was lowering interest rates. Google says the banks didn't even have to pay back the quantitative easing money, so this was basically just free money for the banks and the shareholders. So now comes the part about the big bank bailouts. At the same time in 2008, when the housing market crashed, they also did what's called a bailout. The idea behind it was that since all of our houses were failing and we the people were so broke we couldn't afford to pay our home loans, the banks were going to fail. They had to do something. Someone had to lose there. And guess who lost? It was us. Because they bailed out the banks, but they didn't care about us at all. And all the people lost their homes and the banks got to keep everyone's homes. So it was basically just a hostile takeover of millions of homes. Between quantitative easings and the big bank bailouts, the Federal Reserve printed off the money and gave it to the banks so the banks could continue to keep our homes. And it was basically the theft of countless homes. They inflated the market to where our homes were overvalued. They let the market crash, and then they bought them up super low. Cycles seem to repeat themselves, and it seems like we're on the verge of all this happening again. And when they build out companies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who were big companies that owned lots and lots and lots of homes, those companies eventually failed, and then in turn, the government bought them and got to pick up those homes and now own it, and guess what? Shareholders make lots of money off of them. Just think about the big picture. Our houses were failing. The Federal Reserve printed the money and gave it to the banks so the banks could keep our homes, and we lost everything. This is so wrong, and one of the major reasons why I will never pay the IRS, because they're just going to work hand in hand with the Federal Reserve and manipulate the system, and I will be no part of that in any way, shape, or form. I will not help them steal homes from my fellow Americans. That is so wrong. So now on to the time when they got caught with their hand in the cookie jar and were openly caught cheating the system. This is the LIBOR scandal, and you probably didn't hear about it because it got swept under the rug. So to understand the LIBOR scandal, you have to understand how interest rates are set. Interest rates are set by the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve uses a thing called the federal funds rate to determine this interest. This rate is determined by the 8,000 banks underneath the Federal Reserve. So what happens is, every day, banks are doing business, and sometimes they need to borrow money back and forth, so they loan it to each other. And then every night, they pay it back, and they charge each other interest every night. And this interest rate that they charge each other is what the Federal Reserve looks at and says, okay, this is what they're charging each other. This is now what we're going to set the official interest rate at. They have a meeting every 6 weeks, and every 6 weeks, the interest rate changes. And once they set the official interest rate, then they release it out to everyone and say, hey, this is what we're dealing with for this 6 weeks, and this will be your interest rate now. And from there, banks and all the other lending institutions look at the big interest rate that the Federal Reserve gives and says, okay, now we're going to lend money based on that. But that's how they figure out the main interest rate for the country. And from there, the individual banks that loan us money look at our credit scores and will fluctuate their interest rates they give to us based on our credit scores. But they use the broad interest rate that the Fed gives them as a rough base number on how they're going to lend out money. So now that I've explained how interest rates work, I can explain the LIBOR scandal a little bit more in depth. So in 2012, a group of the largest banks in the world got together and they decided to manipulate their numbers. So what they were doing was they were using these numbers to play the stock market and manipulate the stock market to put money in their pockets. LIBOR was actually in London, and as part of the way they run their financial system over there. But these were some of the largest banks in the world. So their outreach also affected us over here in America as well. And they were able to manipulate the stock market in every country. So it affected everyone. I'm talking about Barclays, JP Morgan, Citigroup, HSBC, and Bank of America. There were about 20 of the largest banks that were part of this. They affected $800 trillion worth of the market, which is an insane amount of money. So their little games they were playing to make a couple $1 billion affected $800 trillion worth of everyone else's stuff. Once again, our national debt is $36 trillion. So the amount of money they were tampering with was 22 times as much as our national debt. It affected every market in the world, including our market here in the US. The fact that they can play with the system and do all this stuff is absolute insanity. These guys were just caught lying and cheating. But if you think about it, all these banks release the interest rates to the Federal Reserve and tell the Federal Reserve what the interest rates are going to be. And then the Fed looks at their numbers and then just releases the interest rates back to them. So this means that big banks know what the interest rates are going to be ahead of time because they're the ones that are actually telling the Federal Reserve what it's going to be. So they can manipulate the stock market all day, every day because they know what the future is going to bring. This is simply how the system is set up. That's just the way things are. So it goes to show you that we're just pawns in their system and they have total control and they're just playing us. The amount of power and pull the banks and the people that run them have is just absolutely unimaginable, which is once again why I refuse to pay my taxes because the game is rigged. So I'm going to close this out with looking at the $5 trillion that the government gave out during COVID. I'm going to start with the fact that they shut down the entire economy and forced us to stop working and stop doing everything. This caused all of us to go into panic mode because we had no way to generate revenue or to be able to survive. In this moment, we basically became completely socialist because we depended on the government in order for our survival. So let's look at it from the big picture for a second. They forced all the small mom and pop businesses to close down, but they allowed corporations and the big businesses to stay open. So when they gave us the money that we desperately needed in order to survive, we immediately went out and spent it with all these corporations. We had no other choice. We had to have supplies in order to survive, and we couldn't spend our money with the mom and pop shops because they were forced by the government to close. So the outcome was record gains for all these corporations and major CEOs. If you look at all the major corporations in this country during that time, you'll see that their profits doubled and all their CEOs' fortunes doubled, literally doubled. But for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And the consequences and repercussions were the loss of countless small businesses. This was all but the destruction of the middle class. And now there's just the lower class and the upper class. All the businesses that were hovering in the middle class got shut down. I don't care where you are in the world. Look around. The only businesses that you're going to see that are not some corporate entity are skilled trade businesses where we put in hands-on labor. These trade businesses are essential to society being able to function. We have to have them in order for society to continue to go on. So they'll never be able to figure out a way to shut those down. But besides the trade businesses, everything is a corporation. And just looking at COVID mandates from an economic standpoint, it destroyed countless small businesses and propped up corporations. And I will not ever be a part of forcing businesses to close and meddling with somebody's business. That is so wrong. That is their livelihood, and you are literally destroying their lives. What the government did to these small business owners is absolutely heartbreaking. And the fact that countless people lost their businesses while corporations and CEOs made record profits is one of the worst tragedies to ever happen to this country. There is one final point I would like to make. When the Federal Reserve printed and handed out $5 trillion, that created a huge amount of inflation. The general public is starting to figure out how much inflation affects everything around us and how much it raises the prices of everything that we have. Every time a dollar is printed, it makes all the other dollars worth less, which means it's going to cost more money for the same exact thing you were previously buying. That's why something that may cost $10 in our currency may cost $10,000 in a different country's currency. That country with the worthless currency printed a lot of money at some point. Inflation devalues the dollar and hence raises the prices of everything around us. The $5 trillion that was printed off and handed out during COVID is directly responsible for the inflation that we're seeing today, plus all the money that was printed up and handed out during Biden's term as well. Throughout history, governments always respond to inflation by printing off more money, which creates more inflation and eventually leads to what's called hyperinflation. When hyperinflation hits, things spiral out of control rapidly. The cost of eggs will go from $10 a dozen to $100 a dozen to $1,000 a dozen to $1 million a dozen and just spin out of control. Most of the time it happens in a matter of months once it starts to happen. And it's not just the cost of eggs, it's the cost of every single item in the country. Everything goes up in price to try and keep up with the fact that the monetary system isn't worth what it was. This usually leads to a currency collapse and extreme economic hardships for countries. From there, new systems are always put in place. What those systems bring and the amount of freedoms people lose in the process is always unknown. I personally am very worried that hyperinflation is on our doorstep right now because of the way we keep printing money. I also feel that they have an electronic currency that they want to replace our dollar with, and that electronic currency will be able to be tracked and monitored and give them absolute control. There's a social credit score in China, and I think they plan to make our new financial system a lot like that one. The most logical thing we can do to stop this and to get the money back in our hands and to create equality and a fair system is to create a financial system based on a tangible object, much like the gold standard. To me, logically, the gold standard could still get monopolized, and the ultra-wealthy could eventually acquire all the gold there is in the world. So to prevent that from happening, we could use a tangible object that was also a renewable resource. A renewable resource as the basis for a monetary system is a great idea because it can never be completely owned and monopolized. It will always regenerate itself through nature. We just have to work out the kinks on how to make it happen. It just needs to be something that we can use and be something productive that society needs. No matter what, it needs to be a tangible object that we can touch with tangible money that can't be manipulated. Call me crazy, but I think that hemp is the best answer for this. We can use it for just about everything. In 1941, Henry Ford unveiled a car that was made from hemp and other organic compounds. He claimed the mixture was 10 times stronger than steel. He also ran the car on hemp. We can use hemp for just about anything. We can use it for medicine, hempcrete, we can use it for clothing. Even hemp seeds are more nutritious than sunflower seeds. We can use it for just about any product we rely on. And it's also biodegradable and would be able to take the place of plastic. So instead of having the trash of one-time use products be here for 10,000 years, we could use hemp and it would biodegrade in less than a year. And one final great aspect of this is that hemp is like a super sponge for CO2. So it would massively clean the planet and it would pull all the CO2 out of the air that we're putting in from our cars. It would clean the planet more than we could possibly comprehend. And our currency doesn't have to be based on hemp, but logically speaking, it has to be based on a tangible object that we can touch. It has to be backed by something, that way it can't be manipulated through inflation and interest like they are currently doing. And from there, it also has to be a tangible object that we can touch and exchange. It can't be just some electronic currency that can be deleted or hacked or unable to use because the internet goes down. We have to be able to use our money in any scenario, even a scenario where we may not have power. In case of a natural disaster, we will lose connectivity and we will need to be able to still use money and still have a way to trade and barter goods. And above all, we have to have a tangible monetary system to ensure our freedom. If the government can control our money and prevent us from being able to use it, they now have control over our lives, and we have lost every single bit of freedom that we have. I think a hemp currency would also be very beneficial because we could create it on a local level and just use all the products that the hemp creates locally and keep control of our financial system right here in our local communities. That way the bigger governments don't have a chance to manipulate our monetary system. We have to keep a tangible currency in order to retain our freedom. We cannot trade efficiency and convenience for our freedom. One final point I would like to bring up is that our military defense budget has been $850 billion a year for many years now. If you divide $850 billion by 153.8 million taxpayers, that averages out to be $5,500 for every single taxpayer in America. That's on average how much every single person is paying every single year. Every single year. On top of everything else, the Department of Defense has not been able to pass an audit for 7 consecutive times now. They lose track of trillions and trillions of dollars. They expect us to pay in and keep perfect track of our records, but the thing that they spend most of our money on cannot even account where our money goes. The amount of our government's hypocrisy is beyond comprehension. It seems these defense contractors are working with our politicians to just do whatever they want in destroying and harming the world. I think it's wrong, and I personally will not be a part of all these weapons they're making and harming the world. Between the Department of Defense spending endless money on wars and harming people, and the irresponsible way our financial system is ran through fractional reserve banking, I morally don't agree with what they're doing. This has been my summary of why I refuse to pay the IRS because of the Federal Reserve. They're massively manipulating our dollar, and we're all just pawns in the game that they're playing. So that's why I refuse to pay taxes. Between them forcing businesses to close down and affecting people's livelihood, to them stealing homes in '08, to the constant manipulation of the system for their own profit, the way I perceive all of this is embezzlement. Everything the Federal Reserve is doing to manipulate the system in this country seems like it's embezzlement from our entire nation on every level. The simple fact that we can't all go withdraw our money from the banks right now should prove this alone. I will not pay taxes and contribute to this system. They are cheating and abusing the financial system so they can take all the assets in this country, thus forcing us to be wage slaves our entire lives to a system that they have cheated and monopolized. This is not what freedom looks like. I refuse to be an accessory and pay taxes to this corrupt system. I challenge the IRS to prove that I'm wrong, and that the Federal Reserve and these banks aren't manipulating the system.